Good morning, everybody. Oh, the mic does work. Welcome to EC's convention and to the Heads Up to Concussion Clinic. My name is Jen Eastwood. I'm the Director of Technical Development for Equestrian Canada, and I come to you with a comprehensive background in equine business consulting and a licensed paralegal with specialization in equine employment and contract law. In addition to that, obviously, I'm British, so I came from England and I trained there, and as a lifelong horse owner, I have a multidisciplinary background across the United States, United Kingdom, and in Canada. So I'm going to welcome you to your panel today. Joining us is Dr. Elisabeth Hobden, right here. She has specialty in emergency medicine and is a certified Canadian Academy of Sports and Exercise Medicine member. She treats injured athletes with concussion and other sport-related injuries and illnesses from the recreational level to the elite level. Elisabeth has served as the lead physician for the equestrian venue at the 2015 Toronto Pan American Games and worked as the venue physician for Bromont. So for the Bromont 3-day event, and is the official physician for the Canadian Equestrian Team. She's based in Ottawa, and when not working, she can be found at the barn. So then our second panelist is Stephanie Cowle. Stephanie has spent the last 8 years in the area of injury and trauma prevention. She's the project manager for Parachute, and just so you all know, Parachute, not the people who fly out the airplanes, which is a national charity that prevents serious and fatal injuries through evidence-based solutions that advocate and educate. Stephanie's experience includes working with partners at community, provincial, and national levels to develop and implement injury prevention strategies. Our third panelist is Anne Welch. Anne is an EC Senior Steward in all disciplines, as well as an FEI dressage and jumping steward. Since 2011, Anne has been working tirelessly to revamp and implement the EC's long-term equestrian development program, which is affectionately known as LTED. She's led the LTED review and then took the role as the chair of the EC LTED working group. In 2017, LTED 2.0 was launched, and it has been lauded as one of the best out of nearly 100 FEI countries worldwide, so we're well recognized, and thank you, Anne, for that. In recognition of Anne's efforts, she was awarded the 2016 EC Volunteer of the Year, and she's known for quietly, I'm not sure quietly, but fiercely supporting Canadian and even international equestrian athletes, taking on many roles, including being a Canadian Equestrian Team horse owner. And then finally, we're joined by Wayne Perro as our moderator. Wayne is a senior coaching consultant with the Coaching Association of Canada. He's a former women's baseball national team coach, a graduate of the National Coaching Institute in Ontario, and a national coaching certification program master coach developer in baseball, hockey, and multi-sport. Prior to joining the Coaching Association of Canada, Wayne was the executive director for the Coaches of Canada, an organization that represented professional coaches in Canada. He has 10 sports in his portfolio, including equestrian, and has a role with the CAC High Performance Mandate and is the e-learning lead with the CAC, working with numerous sports to integrate blended learning, e-learning, and online delivery of the NCCP pathways. This includes making headway to the CAC's concussion education program. I'm going to turn it over to Wayne now.
Thanks, Jen. Welcome, everybody. And just before we get started this morning, I'd like to just sort of put down a little bit of a ground rule. We would like this session to be a little bit interactive. We've got a great presentation. We've got very knowledgeable and experienced panelists. We have some questions that we're going to pose to them. But if you have a question that supports or is even different than what we're starting with, please just raise your hand and I will get to you. And we'll channel the questions through me so that the best person on the panel to answer that question will take up the charge. Just before we get started too, I'd like to get a gauge of who's in the room so we know, our panelists have a feel for what the room what your role is in the room. So do we have any coaches in the room? Raise your hand really tall. Do we have any competitors? Okay. What about administrators? Okay. We're noticing a trend already of multiple roles here, which is normal for sport. Parents. For those in the back that didn't hear it, there was some grumbling up here at this table. I'm not sure why, but that'll be during the break at coffee time. We'll get a sense of that story. So, competition organizers. Okay, so what we see is a very wide range. Was that a late hand or a question? Officials. Good call. Anybody fit into the other category at this point?
I'm actually supposed to be physicians conference next door, but I saw the topic and the speaker, so I thought I'd come over and find out what you're telling people.
There you go. Welcome. Any others in the room? Okay, so we have a sense of who's in the room. And we got started a little bit late, and we have approximately 75 minutes to go through this topic. Again, I encourage you to raise your hand, ask questions as they're fresh in your mind. That way we can address it in the moment, and who knows where that will take us. It will take us down various paths, I'm sure. So let's open this session with the obvious question. I'm going to go to Elisabeth. What is a concussion?
Excellent. So I think we all have a lot of conceptions about what we think a concussion is, but when we talk about that from a medical point of view, it's really an injury caused to the brain by a force or a blow, so it's a trauma. And that can happen from a direct blow to the head, but it can also happen just from the brain being jolted and the movement within the skull itself. So if you imagine like shaking an egg, you know, the yolk goes back and forth and it can break. It's the same with your brain. You don't have to hit your head directly, but there's a jolt to the brain somehow. And what happens is we're starting to understand more and more that there's chemical changes that occur in the brain, and there can actually be some stretching of neurons, and we're not really quite sure how that all happens, but what it comes down to is that the brain changes the way it functions. It can't function properly anymore.
So why are concussions so dangerous?
So I think there's really two reasons that I separate them to in my mind, and one is the immediate result of the concussion. And as I said, your brain doesn't function as it did before. And so that leads to a lot of difficulty in sometimes daily tasks and getting back to the life that you had before. And so people can't really live to their full potential. So that's, you know, the immediate thing that you see. Some of the things that are difficult down the road is that your brain always remains susceptible to other injuries and other concussions. So as you go through life, if you have more concussions, you have a harder time recovering from them. And so this injury stays with you. And the other thing, I don't know how many of you are from Ontario here, but you might remember that just recently there was a law passed called Rowan's Law. And that was brought forth because 16 or 17-year-old high school player of rugby, she was playing rugby, and she suffered a concussion and didn't really tell anybody, didn't get any care. And then about a week later, she was in her next rugby game and got a hit, which would be considered a normal hit in rugby. And she actually died from this injury. And that we refer to as something called second impact syndrome. And again, it's not very well understood, but what we do know is that in rare cases it happens. When the brain is still suffering effects from a concussion, it is very susceptible to other injuries. And in the most dramatic cases, it can lead to death. And so sadly, that was the case for Rowan, but it has moved forward to bring concussion to a wider audience and hopefully to help other people with the enactment of Rowan's Law.
How many people in the room have suffered a concussion? Great question. Diagnosed or undiagnosed? How many people in the room, raise your hands high, think they've suffered a concussion? Okay. How many people know they suffered a concussion? So Aaron, I saw your hand go up right away. How did you feel after the concussion?
I don't know, I felt kind of numb. Like I didn't feel myself. I felt like there was a barrier between how I normally kind of perceptive and how I can be really active. I just felt like I couldn't do that. I felt drowsy and stupid. Like, I don't know how else to
Okay.
explain it.
Who else would like to share how they felt following a known concussion? Nice and loud.
I got kicked in the face by a horse on the prairie. So obviously pretty hurt, bloody nose, very, a little confused, and you don't realize how confused you are. I drove myself home, and then realized I'm not right. I told my husband to take me to the doctor. However, the doctor told me I didn't have a concussion, and I did lose my night vision for about a year afterwards.
Interesting. Okay, so with that in mind, again, Elisabeth, what are some of the myths around concussions?
So I think you both bring up a really good point, and that is that you can self-diagnose, or that you're aware that you're not okay. You both kind of said the sense, well, I kind of knew I was off, but you don't necessarily realize how impaired you are. And that, let's think about it, your brain injured. It makes sense that you wouldn't be able to make good decisions and good calls and put everything together. And I think we forget that when we ask somebody, hey, are you okay? Let's get you back on the horse. And I think that's part of the equestrian culture. I grew up in it. I have kids in it now. But I think it's an important part to just kind of stop and say, hey, you know what? The people around need to be happy that you're okay. And you know that goes into the return to play and that kind of thing. Because the person who is brain injured, who has a concussion, is not necessarily the best person to be making that decision. So that's one of the myths that I think we should think about, is that the person themselves knows if they're okay or not. Another one that I hear a lot is, I was wearing a helmet, so I'm okay. And a helmet does not protect you from a concussion. So that's a really important one to remember as well. It protects you from different kinds of head injuries, but it's never been shown to actually prevent all concussions, and we know that it doesn't. So that's a really important one. We talked about that you don't need to get a blow to the head to have a concussion. You know, it can be a fall where you don't actually hit your head, but your head is jarred. Some people still feel, and you know, we see this even in our medical colleagues, we're still trying to educate, that you don't need a loss of consciousness to have a concussion. So you can fall over, you can get right back up and walk away, but you still may have a concussion. Okay, so that you don't need to be unconscious for any amount of time. And then I think because a concussion is an invisible injury, it's very hard for us to appreciate what somebody else is going through and what somebody else's experience is. And just because somebody is, appears to be recovered, it doesn't mean that they're the same as they were before. And so some of these difficulties that you have after a concussion can be really long-lasting. Like you mentioned, for a year, I noticed that I was still having trouble with something. And the reality is, even though now you might feel well, you're still at higher risk for another concussion. And that lasts all your life. And so I see that coming into my office. I see people who, had a fairly big blow and caused a concussion, and now they're having symptoms with very minor injuries. And so we need to keep in mind that these are cumulative. And so we have to be very careful with that.
One of the interesting comments that we heard here was the reference to helmets, and one of the sports that I'm involved in, and this speaks to how concussion management and identification has evolved over time. There was a time in the sport of hockey that you could go out and buy a concussion helmet. It didn't take very long, maybe 2 years, once it was introduced to the market, for that realization that helmets do not prevent concussions. Question?
Well, we have physicians next door, so that might be really good.
more than once, kids falling off of those coaches, the concussion thing's been driven in our pants for a while. Concussion. So kid falls off, they think they're fine, whatever, doesn't matter. It's like, yeah, you go, because none of us are taking, well, honestly, none of us are taking it on our insurance plan. So we'll send you to somebody else. But so then you send them to the hospital. Send the ER. The ER doctors don't know what concussion is. And they say, oh yeah, you get a little headache, go home, you can play the game on Tuesday. Well, that's not even concussion protocol at all. So then parents got it from doctor, not just coach. So I don't want the kid to ride. The doctor says you can play on Tuesday. You can ride on Tuesday. It's like they're wrong. So how do you argue with the doctor? And it's happened more than once that the ER doctors don't know. Like occasionally they do, and they're on it and they follow protocol. And you go in, throw the kids off the horse for a while. But when they come back, you go,
I think it's a challenge. You raise a good point, and I have a concussion clinic, and I see a wide variety of great management and not so great management when they arrive. And so it's an education process through the physicians as well, and that's slowly happening. I would say in the emergency department, it can be very difficult to diagnose a concussion because there's no test you can do, and they really are there to kind of rule out life-threatening injuries. And 3, sometimes the symptoms of a concussion don't happen for hours to days. So they may be in the emergency department and feel 100%, test 100%, and then wake up the next morning with symptoms. And so there's nothing an individual physician or patient can do to change that, right? If you're fine at the moment. One of the things that I would say as a coach is you could say, you know what, I'm concerned you had a big fall, go to the emergency department, and let's get you to see your family doctor and have a note to return to play. In some sports, particularly hockey comes to mind, if a child is taken out of practice, or you might be able to speak to this too, but I'm writing notes to say they can go back to play. And so, if there's a child you're particularly concerned about, then I would say, you know what, maybe we should just get the family doctor to have another look at this, because there's all sorts of reasons why it may not have been evident.
But it's more the fact that that doctor should know, like they're sending them out with 20-second interview with okay, you're going to play on Tuesday. They should be sending them out with, okay, you know what, you're going to live to the next, my diagnosis is you're going to live for the next 24 or 48 hours, but because of what has happened, there is a protocol that you can follow.
And in my practice, I don't allow anybody to return to play from the emerge. I just won't clear you. You have to see somebody in a situation where they have more time.
That's a problem.
But that's an education. That's an education thing.
Yeah, and it's, sorry, I can speak to that. It certainly is an education piece. I think when we go back talking about myths about concussion, I think it's a myth that in medical schools and nursing schools, our medical practitioners are taught a lot about concussion. Actually, that's not a fact at all. And so what we're having to do, realizing that concussion has come into the spotlight so quickly and gotten so much more awareness. We've seen in Ontario the numbers of people showing up in emergency departments and offices for concussion has skyrocketed, which we actually attribute to awareness, not a sudden increase in concussions happening. So what we have to do, of course, is we kind of have to play catch up a little bit with our health system. And this really is a systemic issue. So we have sport, we have health, we have education, and we all need to work together. That's certainly something, and I'll speak in a little later in the panel about what Parachute's working with the sport organizations with, including Equestrian Canada, but we're also working with the Public Health Agency of Canada to create some more education for physicians around this, specifically for that initial moment of here's how you assess here's appropriate management, here's the important information you have to give to the patient. We've also worked on developing standardized letters, so that medical assessment letter that says I have or have not diagnosed, here's the clearance letter. And we're including those letters in the work we're doing with the sports. So we're trying to close those gaps. We certainly recognize what you're saying, and I have heard that comment pretty much everywhere we go and speak about concussion, so it's clearly a problem, but it's something that's going to take us time to address, but there are efforts underway to address that for sure.
I want to speak to Jill's question. It's a good point, and for those officials in the room who have had to actually sort of take you through the process, so far, to my knowledge on the stats, we haven't had anybody return to play on the same day with the paperwork, the process actually functioning. But it is technically possible, as you've pointed out. Somebody could go to the ER in the morning and on a slow day in local hospital, get in and out in a timely fashion, come back with a piece of paper saying no concussion, and they might go into another jumper class or whatever class in the afternoon. That technically can happen still. I think that this year is, again, this is still a relatively new policy. It was implemented last year. There are some additional stats, I'll mention those later, of what is being collected this year, so we can fine tune. But as Stephanie and Elisabeth have both said, this it's very hard to put your finger on this one entirely, so it's a bit of a dynamic and evolving process. So your point is valid though, Jill.
Let's go back here.
Actually, you've partially answered what I was going to say, but I'd like to come back first of all to your original point about education, and then say that as an official, I have been in positions where other officials or other people that are in some part in management and so on don't have the education either. So somebody falls off in the, let's say, in the warm-up ring, lands on their feet, but lands heavily. I'm going to say, I want you to be checked, because there is a possibility that there could be a concussion in that case. I've worked with officials or with other people who said to me, oh, they landed on their feet, so there can't be a concussion. Concussion has got nothing to do with you being hit in the head. It's the jolt that you mentioned in your very first comment, and that's one of the things that I think we need as organizers, officials, coaches, or whatever we are in this particular discipline, need to be aware of and to educate further.
Great comments.
I thank my sport for all this work we're doing in concussion, because it's has been of help to me, I guess, as a manager of a business with 20 employees, and I'm dealing with a concussion staff person. The first thing that's happened, I think, in our province, being kind of a have-not for physicians recently, it's not improving. A lot of young adults do not have family physicians, and it's a problem. So they're going to walk-in clinics. And that is not the place to go if you have a suspected concussion. And that's been very difficult for us to deal with the staff person who I've been dealing with this since November. And the other problem we're finding, I actually called the provincial sport office to see what resources we might have on file for concussion help. Physiotherapy, are there any I could not get a list, which disappointed me. My employee and myself have actually had to do a lot of calling around and comparison and checking out this place and this place. We finally have now found a physiotherapist that specializes a bit in concussion. But it's been a very stressful process for the person with the concussion, which is not adding to her recovery. So I think, in line with what you're saying with what your program's doing, we need to somehow get more information, more education, and more resources out there. But our sport's been helpful in this process when you have to have a conference call with your staff to say, look, this is concussion. You have to understand what this is, because we had that internal conflict from other staff members too, which can happen in the United States, can happen anywhere.
So the key word that you said there multiple times was education. And that's really why we're all here today. We have a very educated panel. lots of good information, but I can say that nationally and internationally, there's still a lot to learn about concussion.
I guess my question is kind of a second part to that. Is there somewhere that you can find it? Like, I know you specifically touched point on your practice, which I'm guessing is a concussion specialist clinic.
It's sport medicine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like in Calgary, we have an actual concussion management clinic there. But it was my fault that we ran into a specialist from that area that we've been utilizing to do some education pieces for us. But is there a centralized place, or like how do you find which areas have those special clinics? How do you identify those positions? Like, so I guess even as a provincial organization, you could go back to some of this and say, okay, here's a list of places in your area.
It's really difficult because, you know, I sat a few years ago on the Canadian Concussion Collaboration, which is a group of all medical interests like nurses and doctors and emergency doctors and sport med doctors to discuss this. And we tried to give some guidance to the public on how do you identify good concussion care, because there's all sorts of people out there saying that they're experts in concussion and giving all sorts of treatment, some of which are evidence-based, some of which aren't. And that discussion went on for hours and there was no clear answer to it. So, I mean, that's one of the really big difficulties is finding the resources, especially in this sport, because we're not a sport that happens in cities where there's a lot of specialists and that kind of thing, and access even to a family doctor, as you said, can be difficult. So as far as I'm aware, there's no centralized database for that.
Yeah, and to speak to Elisabeth's point, I mean, especially from a national perspective, trying to manage, first of all, manage a directory of anything is quite challenging. It's quite resource intensive, and trying to stay up. If anyone has tried to maintain even a contact list for more than 6 months, it goes out, you start getting those emails, this person no longer works here, this number is no longer connected. That's a challenge unto itself. So we don't really have someone to play that role, but certainly the question has come up about, it's not just about finding someone who says they're an expert in concussion or that has concussion clinic in their name. It's what is the quality of that care and what is the evidence base for that care? So the Canadian Concussion Collaborative did ultimately come out with a sheet that has questions to ask. It doesn't tell you who to call, unfortunately, but it does say these are some key questions to ask to ensure that the clinic that you're looking into for additional care does have evidence-based practices and have the right staff on hand, including access to a physician. There's a number of clinics operating that don't have access to a physician, and that's a red flag. And that's called 4 Characteristics of a Good Concussion Clinic, I believe, is the title of that document. The Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation has also come out with standards for concussion clinics, but those documents are really not sort of for the average person. They're definitely for, it's looking more at, you know, clinical practice management. So, but that's for clinics themselves to look at and say, are we operating by the book? The other thing too is that to recognize and assess and diagnose concussion, but when we're talking about really getting into specialized concussion clinics with long-term care, not everyone with a concussion actually needs that. I think that's another myth. People think that as soon as I have a concussion, I need to be at a specialized clinic. That's more support for people who have persistent ongoing symptoms. So that's one of the other pieces we actually have to work through with improving our primary care, our family physicians and others will actually take some of the load off of those clinics who really should be seeing people who are having those persistent symptoms and need to better manage.
I think too, yeah, so the average adult recovers from concussion in 7 to 10 days, you know, and that's in 90 to 95% of cases. In children, it takes a little longer. It takes, on average, about 4 weeks. But if you're looking at, you know, I would like to think that most of your primary care doctors can do that, but as we've discussed, we're not there yet. It's coming. If you can access the Canadian Academy of Sport and Exercise Medicine website, they do have a list of practitioners. Some of it is available to the public, but you could also, you know, call, and they should have more training than your average GP. But again, they're not available everywhere. sport and exercise medicine.
You started to talk about long-term care. I have a daughter that a little more than 2 years ago came off a horse and basically is still suffering headaches, can't be in any place where there's loud noises. Western University, there's some talk there about going back to reevaluate people who were in long-term care, having long-term symptoms. Do you know anything about that?
No, I can't speak to what's happening at the University of Western Ontario. I haven't heard of it, so I can't really speak to it.
Okay. Only because Sandra was running around last night talking about I know and you just crazy.
Well, she just makes me laugh so hard I can hardly think.
Well, because we were talking about the fall in the ring before the bell went up. Anyway, but we don't have any rules on like falls in the warm up. Okay, falls in the warm up, falls on that, like falls in general. I mean, I think that one is specific. That's what we. But as far as falling and returning, whose the job is?
Okay, a fall is
in all of the different areas.
I think a fall is a fall is a fall. Okay, that you know, if the human and the equine have become separated, we're going to have a conversation. That's your starting point. And I think that I think the officials in the room probably would agree with me that the warm up can be pretty scary, and very much a problem. A fall in the warm-up warrants the medic just as much as a fall in the ring. It's really a case of whose responsibility it is to respond first. If it's in the ring, it's judge's territory, and the medic very often is actually watching that ring, depending on your level of competition, whatever, depending if you've got multiple medics. If it falls elsewhere, he or she falls elsewhere, then the steward is technically your next level of defense. Beyond that, we know that there are falls in the barn. I mean, there can be some terrible falls in the barn. I can think of one now that, mounting a horse just sounds so simple, doesn't it? Yes, very dangerous, bad fall.
Well, actually, digging in your tack box.
At that point, we have to rely on friends, people who are around. And this goes to the education point that we need to be aware and we need to look out for people. If somebody has had a fall or has had an injury, hurt themselves, however you wish to describe it, the person, apart from getting a medic and looking after that individual, you must tell an official. And we do need to really educate that point. Because the official has the ability not to fix the problem, but to coordinate the problem. They have the ability to make sure that we get the medic, medic has had to go, that we know about it, that we can report it, and that we can make sure that if it's appropriate, that individual doesn't go into the ring next. Like Aaron, I had a concussion and felt pretty dumb, and I didn't feel dumb until I realized how dumb I had been when I too was driving. And I was so efficient that day. It was before Christmas. My goodness, I got things done, tick, tick, tick. And I got home and I was not in good shape at all. So many bad decisions made along the way. A damn good thing, excuse my language, that I wasn't going into a meter 30 class. How about it? Right? Those are, every single step you take is a decision when you're riding. So I think from that perspective, we have to pay attention and we must educate, and we must not feel that we're squealing on somebody who really says, oh, don't bother, I've got a class in just 5 minutes.
But you're must.
We have to help.
Must, but it's actually should.
We must and should.
Well, must would mean
And well, must is something we aspire to, but should, absolutely. We need to understand that we're helping here. Ethically, we must. And we have a responsibility to do that.
This is one of the challenges that we have in recognizing and managing concussions. It's the must versus should discussion. Because There are so many variables, as have already been presented, for the individual that may have experienced a concussion, and there are so many variables for people around that person to recognize and then act accordingly. Last question here, we will move on with our topic.
Just quickly, if there's an incident like that outside of the show ring, either in the stable area or the roller ring, and it's reported to the steward.
Correct.
Does the steward have the authority to say you cannot go back in the ring? If the child or the parent or the coach says, oh my God, it's the jump off, it's the equitation ride off, whatever, she has to go.
A mentor of mine once said, stewards are lions without teeth. And so responsibility, yes. Authority, no. But we have some tools.
So if that person
We have tools.
goes back in the ring, there's nothing stopping.
I can make them see the medic. Okay? I can make them see the medic. And I can talk their head off and stall. And oh, gee, oh, you missed your ride. You know, worst scenario, right? Ridiculous, but I am sure that there are several in this room who have used that tool. But no, we have the authority to make sure that they are seen by the medic.
Great questions, and let's keep it up. Now, I want to take that's actually a little bit of a segue into, I want to go back to Stephanie, and I want you to start us, because we're talking about protocols here, and the must versus should aspect of managing concussions. What's the barometer nationally, internationally around protocols for managing concussions?
Yeah, so I think where we need to start with is the fact that over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen an absolute explosion in research in the field of concussion compared to past years. And when we're looking at research in concussion, we're talking about everything from what's the actual biomechanics of how a concussion caused, what's really happening in the brain, how do we diagnose it, what does proper treatment and recovery look like, how can we actually tell when someone's actually recovered from a concussion. We're also seeing research diving into looking more specifically at certain populations. One of the areas that's starting to grow is looking at concussion specifically in females, and there's been some really interesting findings there. And the really great thing, the exciting thing for us as Canadians is Canada is extremely strongly represented in the international field of concussion research. So we are there at the table, and we're there really contributing. And so as Canadians, we can really benefit from having that expertise within our country. And at Parachute, we work with an expert advisory of concussion experts from across our country in different research fields and clinical disciplines. But that research is only as valuable as we put it into practice. And when we're talking about sport, we're looking at how does the evidence inform how we recognize possible concussion in an athlete? How do we remove them from play? How do we make sure they get appropriate assessment and recovery? For the best possible return to daily living, first and foremost, to school and to work, and then finally to competing and doing those sort of active things that you love. And so we do look to the evidence for these things. And in Canada, what we've been focusing on is sort of the idea of harmonization. So thinking about how do our sport organizations, starting there, other organizations as well, how do our sport organizations all align using consistent best practice for concussion in our concussion protocols? So for about a year and a half now, Parachute's been working with the Public Health Agency of Canada and Sport Canada, as well as a large number of sport organizations, including Equestrian Canada, including the Coaching Association of Canada, who's been a valuable partner in this as well. We've all been working together to bring some consistency to concussion protocols across national sports, ensuring that those protocols are up to date, because as we know, the research is building, we have new information, we need to keep our protocols up to date, and making sure there's consistency, so there's that practice across Canada, there's not conflict, especially when you talk about people have multiple roles, people participate in multiple sports. We want to make sure that they're getting the same practice and the same information. But once we have that information in place in protocols, the next piece, of course, is what we've been talking about, awareness. We need everyone to understand not only some basic concepts around concussion, what it is, why it's a risk, why it's important to take seriously, but also what are the policies within your sport and within your organization, and what's everyone's role in it. And certainly coming back to this idea of recognizing a possible concussion, that's where we say it's absolutely everyone's role, because our health professionals are the ones who can diagnose a concussion, but anyone can recognize possible signs and symptoms. And we all have a responsibility to say, something didn't look right there. And we all make judgments like that in our lives every day. As a professional, as a parent, as a friend, you're constantly making those judgment decisions, and concussion is really no different in that.
Yes.
Right now, under the Equine Canada program with all of this, the coaches are expected to take a certain number of courses which are offered by Sport Canada and so on. For example, making ethical decisions, responsibility and so on. And one of those is the basic premise on concussion. I would suggest, and I guess this is coming because I am an official, I would say that should also be a requirement of our officials. I would like to see the officials have to do respecting sport and making ethical decisions as well. But I think the one on concussion, which I believe has been essentially put together by parachute,
coaching. It's actually through Coaching Association, we certainly encourage it, and some of our resources are shared, yeah.
Coaches do this. I think that's a step forward for all of those of us who are officials. And I know some of my official friends are going to groan and say, we already have too many things that we have to do. But it's an online program. You can do it sitting in an armchair with your knitting in one hand or whatever.
It's a picture.
So why are we not supporting or promoting the idea that would be covered in other areas?
So I'll speak to that. It's a shameless self-promotion to some degree that I was going to save to the end, but thanks very much for bringing it up this early in the conversation. 30 seconds. What's being referred to here is our concussion management program called Making Headway. It's free. That's a key thing. You can access it at coach.ca. If you are not a coach, you can still do it. You will be asked to create an NCCP number, which is all done automatically in our system. So you'll end up in our coaching database, but that's not a bad thing. Once you have that NCCP number, look for the e-learning tab at the top, click on it, you'll find Making Headway. Now what's interesting about Making Headway is there's 6 different versions of it. There's a generic sport version, and then there are a number of sport-specific versions. Equestrian is not one of those versions yet, but that's something Jen and I will discuss over time. The interesting thing that I'll say about this is that we are literally, probably today, releasing an updated version, because as you've heard from the panel so far, things move so quickly. There was a conference in Berlin in February of 2017.
October 2016, but the results were published in 2017, yes.
Results were published in February. We've done 2 revisions to that product since February of 2017. That's A, great, but B, a real struggle, both from a financial perspective and from a resource perspective. So it's there for anybody if you are interested. It covers a lot of what we've heard, especially the idea of the responsibility of everybody and the responsibility that everybody has to recognize what may look like a concussion or a situation that may look like a concussion.
2 seconds, can't we put it as mandatory to get a competitive license?
These are things that are actually being discussed by the newly formed National Coaching Operations Committee, the chair of which is sitting in the room here right now, and I'm sure she's feverishly making notes, so we'll leave it with Erin. I want to go back to the panel here if I could, and because we're going into the equestrian-specific questioning now, which is great. So Anne, can you talk to us a little bit about EC's concussion policies and how they're all playing out?
All right. This started in discussion at what is a defunct committee, which is probably a good thing, about 5-6 years ago. It was very clear, sport part of our federation couldn't get away from the fact that, you know, we were considered to be a very dangerous sport. You know, oh, we've got medical issues, and, you know, what we need to, you know, what do we need to be focusing on so that we appear to be better than what was a perception at the time. And certainly making it very clear that we had good accident reports, that we had oversight there. And obviously, at the time, I think it was a misnomer, but it was in support of helmets, which of course is not the issue. But it was a way to get concussion on the table. And it was agreed literally 5 or 6 years ago that yes, we needed to have a concussion protocol, which would require a policy, et cetera. And so that's when it started. It was a long time because it did stay rather convoluted with helmets, and that discussion in our federation is as diverse as our various disciplines. So I'm going to actually hand over to Jen for just a second to just talk about maybe what the NSO role is and how we then refocused back.
Thank you. So the NSO role is to be the leader and to bring awareness and education to the concussion issue. And from that, we actually create the policies that are needed in order to create the safe sport environment. Those policies are made with various subject matter experts. In this particular case, we had stakeholders such as Parachute and also expert physicians such as Rob Stevenson. That's sort of how we came around, and that's our role at this point, is to create policies that work and then to listen to the metrics that come back from that to make sure that they're working, and then to listen to your comments on them too to make sure that they're enforceable, because there's no point in having a policy that you can't enforce. So that's kind of where we've gone with that.
That's the NSO role, which is very much the the policy and the overseer. Then it really created the small group, of which I was a member, as were I think 3 others, stewards from across the country, different disciplines, to try and make sure that somewhere along the line we could actually operate. And that was the policy that the officials in this room, and is everybody aware that in 2017 that the concussion protocol created a new rule? Anyone that didn't know that in equestrian? Super. Okay, so it was implemented last year. It produced the statistics that you've seen occasionally up on the board. Virtually every discipline. It did touch every discipline. There were, I think, roughly 65 individuals who were suspended medically and went through the policy. We have stories on the ground, for sure. It was not 100% smooth for many of the reasons that, you said, what do you do? Did it happen? We don't know what we didn't see. One of the issues is the very broad definition of medical support at competition. That was scheduled to go in for this year, 2018, to up that level quite substantially to what was referred to as qualified medical support, which would be a first responder level. Many of our competitions, and I'm sure you probably in the room know this, have maybe as few as 11 to 20, 30 horses in them, and may have a very, very well trained first aid help in a mother or whatever. And we have those, and we have them all the way up to competitions with 1,000 riders and a very sophisticated medical team. Somewhere in the middle, we had to come up with some rules. And so we left the medical where it was, because it was not possible to just turn to every organizer across the country and go, okay, boom, this is what you've got to have. It was meant to be in place for 2018. As Jen said, there was consultation. It was very clear that the organizers needed some additional help, some education, some support. We needed to find out where they could find medics that were meeting the standard at a way that people could do this
equally across the country and make it sustainable. So that's now on slate to go in for 2019. It says it very clearly in the rules that it will be 2019. At the same time, this year we're doing a lot of research and data collection through two different questions, two different reports that exist now, a steward report and a competition manager report that tells us exactly what the level of medical support is at each competition. That will tell us, my basic rule then when you're bringing in a new rule is you want at least 60% already in. So with a little bit of luck, we're going to have enough information back that will tell us that the majority have got the right level and we can work with those who don't. That's my hope. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, it's pretty early in the competition season right now. We have no data yet. So that went into play. The officials were all taught, given a webinar last year, free webinar run by Equestrian Canada, which was very new for them too. I think actually overall did a hell of a job. Certainly, I think it covered maybe 90% of the officials, certainly of the stewards. Yeah. I don't think it's on schedule to be repeated quite yet, but I believe it's been discussed.
Yes, it is.
So the education is coming along, and the medics are being taught, because each time you go to a show, the stewards on the whole are meeting with that medic and making sure. I know that last year, I took the rule and I went, okay, this is the rule and here's the form and this is what we're doing now. In almost every case, it was, oh, hallelujah. So that was good. I did hear back from some organizers when I was asking some questions, and that is in the last few weeks for this. And I found a gap, imagine that. And so your medic team comes in, you've ordered a service from ABC Medical, and the medic shows up on day one, it's great, you go through it, you have the discussion, it's all good. Day two, golly, brand new medic, through the service. So I think, as for me, I've found a new gap that I have to fill. I've got to have the conversation daily now. So we created the policy, initiated it, and it's been tweaked a little this year, and a lot of data collection, and it will continue to change. So as much as the concussion protocols change, I think.
So you said you don't really have data, so...
Support.
Okay, but are you getting any feedback on how well the rules are working so far?
Yeah, you get, the only negative you get, or we have seen so far, and out of roughly 60, is when the individual or the person with that individual says, oh, poop, nonsense, back on the horse. Very often, it's the confusion speaking. The policy, it's working. It is working. It can be a little bit challenging, but I think that the medics, the stronger your medic is, the better the system, without a question. But on the other hand, if it is mom who's the first aid, you can look at the individual and say, you know what? Nobody's taking responsibility for this. You're done. You may not compete. Now you are medically suspended as of this moment, and you must go through this protocol. So it is working, and I've spoken with 2 people who've gone through it, who have said it worked well for them. There are some kinks in the system. Some of them are bureaucratic, but I think that's been dealt with. I found one thing out this past week for organizers that they had no idea how to find a simple way to find out who's actually suspended. It's actually totally available on the EC website, which I'm going to work with Jen actually next week as to show you how to find that and make sure the organizers know how to do that too. So yes, it's working.
So you indicate it's working, but what's your sense of the level of buy-in across the whole community?
Mixed. Yeah. Mixed, very mixed. Parents, it's funny. A parent who is not a coach and isn't an equestrian, not a problem. A parent who is an equestrian, big problem.
And I can say, as a parent, I'm very guilty of that. You get on the horse or go to the hospital, pick which one you want to do. So it's re-educating us as parents, as coaches, as the stakeholders that in the past we've always been told, you know, pretty much get back up on that horse, you've fallen off, carry on. And we have to learn that not getting back up on that horse maybe is a stronger decision. We've often seen that as a weakness, but maybe at this point in time that's not a weakness, because there are medical reasons why we shouldn't maybe get back on that horse.
We had, if I can just add one thing to that, Wayne. One of the initial concerns of the group creating this first year of implementation was, what do we say to the high performance jumper? I'm selecting jumper out really because that's the only sport with a large financial prize in it, who is potentially on track to go in and thinks, as they should, that they have a crack at winning that $50,000 or whatever the amount is. This is a problem. To that, we've had a couple of high performance riders, mostly in national classes, because the FEI, the international end, speaks there. I think that if ever there was one really important thing, we try not to attach everything to, if it's a money class, what do you need to have with it for infrastructure? But if it's a big money class, you'd better hope you have a very good medic, very accredited medic, where that discussion doesn't have to come into play. I will point out that for our international federation, for the equestrian, our program was presented at both their safety and at the global, Global Sport Forum, and it got a lot of support, huge amount of support.
And this issue, particularly of athletes wanting to stay in competition, is not specific to equestrian, as you can imagine. It's not even specific to elite sport. I literally had to force a guy in a rec beer softball league to sit on the bench. He visibly had a concussion. He literally had blood in his ear, and I had to say, no, you can sit here for a bit, and you're going to go see the doctor after this. And so it's not even the level of competition or even the money amount, but certainly when you have an adult athlete, and there are things we think about, the Olympics are at stake or what have you. Those are certainly questions, but this is a challenge that all sports are talking about together. And again, it's a pretty large culture shift. And so we want to tackle this, but we do have to give it some time, because it's like any other health issue. We can think about all the classic examples: smoking, drinking and driving, wearing your seatbelt. All of these things, they do take time to get all that buy-in, but the more support we can get, the more education we can do will really help us chip away at that resistance.
And sorry, I was just going to say, don't think that it's just at the sporting level. These conversations happen in the doctor's office as well, with parents or athletes who want to participate and elite athletes who have lots on the line. And ultimately, that's a decision between the treatment provider and the athlete. So it doesn't fall all on the sport's heads. This happens in the doctor's office as well, and it's a challenge. And there's no absolute right or wrong answer for each individual situation. When you get into situations like this, it's a very difficult problem. So you're not alone.
I actually only had two comments to make. I agree with what Stephanie said. A lot of our issue with the sport per se is the culture. We try to be tough. Speaking as a coach, as an athlete, as an official, I've been schooling young horses at home, tipped over, got up and went, I just got my belt right, that was special. And then got back on and not even given it a second thought. So I think that it comes back to the education again as well. And just to what Anne said about competitions, I think we struggle sometimes at competitions, particularly the silver and bronze level competitions, where the budget is a little smaller. They might have the money for a medic. However, some of the officials they're using are local officials, right? And when you get in a closed group like that, where I know if I'm telling Anne's kids that they can't get back on the horse, I have to look at Anne next week, and that's going to cause problems. So I think we have to be very cognizant of that. It's a very closed group. And, it's hard to make waves and stand up for what's right when you think that person's not going to hire me to do their horse show ever again because I stood for what was right, and now as the show manager, they had to deal with it. So I think we need to make sure that whatever protocols and et cetera was sent forward, if you're going to give the officials the responsibility, they have to have that support, right? Because that becomes a huge issue.
This couple of really significant words that we've heard in the last few statements: culture. Okay. And yeah, it's not only in this sport. Every sport has a culture that is, in my words, would be negative to concussions. And to your point, recognizing what's doing right in the National Coaching Certification Program and the content that we heard earlier, we talk about the do no harm principle. If it's even remotely possible, we have to put the athlete's health and well-being ahead. Erin.
I have 2 questions. First one, is baseline testing becoming like a right?
So certainly baseline testing is something we've heard a lot about in recent years. The first thing to know about baseline testing is it really is an umbrella term. There isn't a specific standard for what baseline testing means. So someone could offer baseline testing and it could be a 5-minute computer test. Someone could, a clinic could offer a procedure that takes a couple hours to complete. So first and foremost, knowing that it really is a general term and it doesn't mean you're gonna get a specific type of testing. For those who aren't totally familiar with what baseline testing is, it essentially seeks to, you're taking certain measurements of the athlete, particularly their neurocognitive functioning, at their baseline, meaning they're not injured, just normal every day, this is where they're at. So that if they were to hit their head, you would then do that testing after the injury and kind of compare how are they measuring up, are their numbers off? That's the idea behind it. But the research shows it doesn't work that simply. So particularly when we're looking at the young brain, it is constantly changing. So under 18, it is absolutely, generally speaking, not recommended for young people. The brain is developing constantly. So even if you, without an injury, if you did baseline testing on a young person, the research is showing that their numbers would change. There are some considerations that this might be helpful for youth who have particular conditions, such as ADHD and others. The problem is we don't have that specific description of this is exactly who baseline testing would work really well for. So we can't say to you, this is the perfect candidate. So really right now, based on the evidence, the recommendation is that it shouldn't be used widespread. Now, there again is a lot of marketing around baseline testing and concussion in general, recognizing that, I mean, we're all here because we care about this topic. There are people, unfortunately, who are capitalizing that and are creating products. Not to say that they're totally negative intentions, but money comes with it. And so we have to be sure that if we're looking at anything monetary, that it really is evidence-based. And so the way baseline testing is getting marketed is telling parents and organizations really that baseline testing is necessary to protect your athletes. That is false. An athlete can receive appropriate assessment and care with or without a baseline test, okay? It is not mandatory for post-injury care. I have also seen claims on websites that baseline testing somehow is related to concussion prevention. I have not quite figured out how that's supposed to work, but it doesn't make sense how a test can prevent a concussion. But these really are the ways it's being positioned, and I've spoken specifically, and I'm sure Wayne can speak to this, and potentially your EC reps, that sport organizations are receiving phone calls and emails from companies and other clinics that are trying to sell baseline testing services. Says, you need to make this mandatory for all your athletes. You need to mass enroll all of your athletes in this, of course for a fee, and that's just not true. And you know, parents, sport orgs, clinics are being targeted to offer these services, and it's just not a necessary component. there is a lot of research being done in the area of baseline testing. If we can get to a point in the evidence that says, here's how it can be implemented properly, here's who it's best used for, when that evidence is available, we'll be happy to share that and really buy into that. But right now, we just don't have the evidence to support how widely it's being marketed right now. We're really encouraging organizations, schools, sport orgs to really focus your resources on awareness and education, on implementing your protocol, getting players removed, getting them managed properly and back to sport in the best way possible. Elisabeth, I'm not sure if you want to add to my mini rant.
No, I mean, I think I agree. The evidence is not there that baseline testing is what we had hoped it would be. You know, there was some hope that it would be like, yes, you can go back, you're fine, and it's just not working out that way. So it is a tool, but it's not a necessary tool. You know, it can add more information, so can it be helpful? Yes. Is it necessary? No. And particularly in a lot of, as you said, the younger athletes, we don't really know what to do with that information because you don't have the same brain you had 6 months ago anyways. So I don't think it's necessary. Again, there is push for it from certain organizations, and you know, for certain people there may be merit to it, but again, we are not sure who those people are. As a across-the-board testing to recommend that, you know, your athletes go out and get baseline tested, I don't think we're there yet.
I had a hand back up here.
There was a second part to the question.
I want to answer Erin's second part of her question.
Sure.
Is that all right? To your question, Erin, at this point, Jen's going to, I think, want to speak to how the PTSO and jibes with the NSO, but it's a little premature for the organizers right now. This year, every competition management report, the CMRs, which you've seen, has a new question on it. After the list of, you know, who is your medic and you know, what level, there's another question is, the rule for 2019, blah, 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 requires this. Are there any barriers to you achieving this? If so, what do you need? How can we help you? So I think maybe 6 months from now, when we're sort of, you know, we've got maybe 30% of the competition reports in, maybe there will be a clear answer as to what the organizers need in the way of support there and help, okay? So I'll tell you that, and maybe you can speak to
that's where I would go with this. We need the data in order to know where we need to support you. Otherwise, we're just throwing mud at the wall and hoping something will stick. So to that end, we will have support for you. We just don't know what the support you need is at this point in time. But that is to say, at least you now know that we are listening. We are reviewing that. We are taking into consideration the requirements of the provinces, of the smaller venues, and those of the larger venues, to make sure that we balance this program, that it's enforceable, it is doable, and that we aren't putting in place something that's set for failure.
You might just, throughout the provinces, just recheck your definition of the qualified medical personnel. It is first responder, and those courses can be done through the Red Cross. That would maybe be first place to start, is maybe collaborating with groups and creating some environments for to build those credentials.
I wanted to add just one quick thing I should have mentioned back to the baseline testing piece. Parachute did put out a statement on baseline testing in Canada in 2017, along with a fact sheet that kind of explains a little bit more of the simple information that's really great to share with parents and others. So accessing that resource might help you in how to respond to people that are maybe contacting you and pushing you, and also parents that ask. It's helpful to have that wording and evidence background, so it is on parachutecanada.org.
Did you have a question?
And this has a legal element. We don't have any legal experts in the room, I don't think. So, but I'll throw this out because it has to do with safety, and there isn't really a concrete rule for it. We've already established that there may be confusion, not feeling very smart, making bad decisions. We have lots of coaches who are riders. So a rider goes in and they are given a medical suspension, but they go out in a busy warm-up all afternoon and coach. So under the coach, are they capable of making that decision? And with liable that it can happen. And as an organizer, you don't prevent them.
Give it to you, Wayne. As an official at a competition, I may not have necessarily all the accurate information on whether the coach is an accredited coach, etc. I want to throw this one to Wayne, maybe.
Well, I can speak a little bit to when we're talking about, so if I'm understanding correctly, a person suffers a concussion, but they go to fulfill another role. Right. So again, if we're looking at following best practice, if a person has a concussion, now this is assuming that that concussion has been recognized and they haven't just left. If it has been recognized, there's a couple different aspects to recovery from concussion, and these are gradual progressions back to daily life, cognitive activity, and physical activity. So in addition to a person with a concussion having some initial rest and then gradually working back up their physical activity and ultimately getting back to their sport, we also need to see people progressing the same way through return to other daily activities that require using your brain. So that might mean probably staying home from school for a couple days or work, and building back in those activities. So if the process is followed, a person who has sustained a concussion should not be going back to coaching or work or that the next day. Those also need to be gradually built up as their symptoms improve to make sure that they're not putting extra strain on their brain and actually delaying their recovery.
So from...
But I think
that they would not assume that role or put themselves in a potentially dangerous situation. So it would be reasonable request from someone to say, perhaps we should not be on that side of the fence.
I think that's a very difficult situation because the person making the suspension is not necessarily diagnosing a concussion. They are saying, we believe you have a potential to have a concussion. And so that person, even when we're talking about a first responder, it is a higher level of medical care than your standard first aid, but they still get no training in concussion. Okay, so we can't lay that onto them to say, you have a concussion, this is how you're going to get better. They're just not trained to do that. What the protocol asks them to do is to say, you know what, you might have a concussion. So, I mean, you're bringing up a very gray area. They're suspended to compete, but they're not actually suspended for coaching. And then they may not have got that information. You know, it depends who's covering that event, what the conversation was, but the person covering that may not actually have the knowledge to have that conversation with them.
I guess I would go back to coaching for them to have that kind of discussion. And there's what is an ethical resource.
I think from a practical standpoint, at this point in time, we can't, you know, unless there's a visible injury that, and by visible I mean that, you know, there's cognitive issues, you can clearly see that there's a problem. We can't really say, no, you can't coach at that show after being medically suspended for a fall. We have a limited scope with this right now.
So, yes, and being one of the coaching persons in the room, this is why I said at the very beginning of this morning's session, we're still at the start line with all of this. And crossing over issues like that haven't even been thought of before are starting to come to light. Exactly. And I'm sure there will be others that come forward that we haven't seen that we need to address. But it's being very heavily discussed. I'm going to have to stop the questions here for a moment because there's a couple of really key things and we're really on short time. So there's a couple of key things that we want to put out quickly. And let's go to Rowan's Law very quickly. Stephanie.
Yeah. So how many people here actually live or work in Ontario? A good portion, okay. And how many people have heard about the passing of Rowan's Law? Okay, thank you. So the intent of Rowan's Law is really to improve concussion awareness and management of concussion for young athletes in Ontario. Elisabeth mentioned earlier the story of Rowan Stringer, who did pass away at the age of 17 from second impact syndrome. And her parents, Gordon and Kathleen Stringer, have been really strong advocates in the wake of that this should not happen to another young person. And Parachute and a number of partners have been involved in an advisory committee. Rowan's Law was passed recently. It is a provincial piece of legislation, and it's really targeting, as I said, increasing concussion awareness and processes. Some of the pieces involved in Rowan's Law will be requiring Ontario sporting organizations, as well as actually the definition of sporting organization would also include schools. So essentially any organization that's overseeing some kind of sport competition event would be required to have a few things in place, including having a protocol for removing athletes from play, having a protocol about return to learn and return to sport for their athletes, as well as having using some of the concussion awareness resources approved by the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport in Ontario. So this was passed, and this will certainly impact the sport organizations in Ontario. But one thing about this law is that there need to be regulations written to actually enforce the law, and those haven't been written yet. So while it's been passed, the law is not yet in effect in Ontario, and we're waiting to see what those actual regulations are going to be that sport organizations will have to follow. We have a provincial election coming this summer, so this is going to be on hold probably at least until the fall and going into the new year. It's important that provincial sport organizations be aware that this is coming. And it's also important for organizations like Equestrian Canada that have partners operating in the province that this is going to have an impact. What we will say is we are trying to continue to have ongoing conversations with the Ontario Ministry, and the work that we've been doing at the national level with Equestrian Canada on their protocol and the other sport organizations for now is completely aligned with what will be required under Rowan's Law. So we're quite confident that if the provincial organization does follow Equestrian Canada's lead, that will be in accordance with that law, but we have to see what the written regulations are. And this is actually beginning to be a bit of a trend. Manitoba will be retabling some concussion legislation. It won't be identical to Rowan's Law, but similar idea of provincial sport organizations having protocols in place. And we're starting to see other provinces and territories turn a bit of an eye to this now, having a couple provincial leaders.
Excellent. So we're just about at our curfew here, but I want to go back to the panel. Elisabeth, what needs to be said that hasn't been said so far from your perspective?
I think it's been said. I think what we need to kind of take to the forefront is education of athletes, of coaches, of officials, and within our own areas, parents, because concussion is a life-changing event.
Anne, same question.
I think probably what I would like to get across is that officials are not the devil incarnate, especially the stewards, and that our very first premise is to help. And if we could get across the message that we are there to help, and if somebody sees something, hears of something, they can help by coming to see us.
Steph.
Yeah, I think just driving home, ultimately at the end of the day, it sounds like process, it sounds like some struggle and barriers. It's about the health and welfare of the athlete. And what we know from the research is if a concussion gets diagnosed earlier, if we have proper management, then the chance of long-term symptoms of prolonged recovery diminishes. So it's really about getting people the help they need to recover. And it's about getting them back to the sport they love, and we really want to focus on that. So when you're faced with those challenges, remember at the end of the day, like everything else you do, it's about the athlete's welfare.
I want to thank you on behalf of EC for attending this session this morning. I'm sure our panelists won't be bolting out the door, but they likely have other things on their agenda this morning. So if you have any other burning questions, you can probably corner them before they exit the room. Thanks very much for attending this morning's sessions. Thank you to our panelists and Jen. And enjoy the rest of the conference.